I mean, this is getting ahead of us maybe a little bit, but since you're on this, I mean, I think the part of the reason why I think this Obamacare thing, where there's this sort of fealty to it, I think on one end of the spectrum, I think people want to maintain this, private health insurance model. I think the other one, which is I think more immediate, is that for all the candidates to some extent, some candidates far more so, they want to play off of the support that Obama still has amongst Democratic voters writ large, and particularly in the black community. Obama was able to mobilize, and this is coming back into this discussion. I'm just noticing is coming back into play much more as we get closer to the general election. Right, people talk about the Obama to Trump voters, and there's a lot more, I think, attention's being paid to the Obama to nobody voters from 2012 into 2016. And I should also just take this moment to apologize to people. I got corrected by John from San Antonio, sent me a little message. Trump received over 2 million votes across the nation, more than Romney. Romney did receive over 2,000 more votes than Trump in Wisconsin. But John wants to remind everybody.
So you got taken to the fact check saloon.
But there were about 4 million voters nationally who voted for Obama and did not vote for anybody.
I mean, that's the point. I mean, I think that going back to that data point you just read, a lot of people speak to how many votes that Hillary Clinton got. Like I think she did get the most votes of any Democratic candidate in history, but due to population growth, that's like inevitable. It's not a direct comparison. You have to account for the number of new voters into the system. But when you actually look at people, proportionally people who voted in 2008 for Obama, 2012 for Obama, versus who voted in 2016 for Obama. I'm not for Obama. I'm assumably the father from Get Out still voted for Obama, but who voted generally speaking, you see a proportional reduction or stagnation in voters. And I think that's important to contend with as well. Like what caused people, like less people overall, or rather proportional to the population who could vote to come out versus in Obama, because that's a different sort of thing to ask.
Yes. In fact, he does. He's talked about the difference between voting eligible population, voting age population on the show. And
John's good.
Right. But
he's really
there is this this question of how to reach those people, and the question of, inevitably that comes up in the context, particularly as Bernie gets closer, and also just sort of like, it came up this week when Sanders got endorsed by Joe Rogan, who, I think varying different groups of people online appreciate the value of that endorsement. There was also a question as, should the campaign have been officially promoting that they got the endorsement like they did, as opposed to like, okay, we got endorsed by Joe Rogan. Welcome. I went on the show. Everybody else wanted to go on the show. My understanding is just about every other, not Biden probably, but Buttigieg.
No, Biden did.
Oh, did he?
I think all of them went.
Wow.
And only Tulsi Yang and Bernie were invited.
Yeah. And but I mean, that as it may,
I would love to see Biden on Rogan, if I may just tangent for a second.
Come on,
Rogan would roll Biden.
Rogan.
That would ruin Biden's career.
But
come on, man.
But there is this question, and I listened at least in part to the episode, an episode that you did back in 2018. Entitled Bernie's White Slavery Agenda.
That's a good one. Good title.
That's a good title.
Was a good
I didn't name it personally, though.
But
but you're the proprietor.
Whoa.
That was before you were executive producer.
I have subcontractors who take care of that.
Exactly.
All above board.
But the point being that, there's what we're going to hear over the next 3 or 4 months, if Sanders is way out in the lead, if he is significantly competitive, is going to be this talk about the way that he speaks about race, the way he speaks about gender, the level of sensitivity. It's going to go both ways, right? Because part of it is that part of the sales pitch of Sanders versus Warren for some people is that, without getting into the distinction in terms of policies for a moment, that they are at least similarly situated on the left to some extent, but that Sanders does not have the sort of baggage, maybe just by the virtue of being a white guy, of the perception that he is PC or whatever it is. Where is what's your take on this? I mean, at least in the context of and I know that at least the sentiment there was that there's nobody in the race who's talking about race properly or in an interesting way.
Well, I'll address the first part of what you said first, right? I think when people talk about how do you reach these voters that Obama lost or that switched Obama to Trump or who voted for Clinton in 96 and Clinton 92, there doesn't seem, at least among some people who are discussing this topic, to recognize that the voting population, they learn. They're a dynamic body. People who are voting are learning things and making decisions based on how they were treated in the past administration, right? A lot of the people who voted for Obama and turned out for Trump, they felt betrayed by Obama. I think that there is a sentiment amongst many especially younger people who this was their first election. 2008 was their first election for Obama. That he ran on a populist sounding platform, change, hope. We're going to do things differently. He indexed a lot of things that people found to be change from the normal, what they consider to be normal politics of the Democratic and Republican establishments fighting. Then he didn't do that. He came in, and I mean, I think some people make the argument as well that, well, if you were really, really paying attention to Obama, you would see that he really wasn't about, the life that people were projecting on them. I mean, that's probably true, but I think a lot of people, weren't paying attention. Substantial people were they engage in politics at a, not necessarily shallow level, but deep enough to learn about a politician, to hear what they're saying, to engage with it, and they take them on their face value. And I think a lot of people took Obama on face value and felt betrayed by that. Going to the question about...
We played a video very recently of Obama. It's hard to listen to now because he really does sound like a left populist who's going to take on Wall Street. And obviously that did not turn out to be the case. I voted for Obama in 2008. I was very excited to do it. And then by 2012, I was voting for a Green New Deal.
I mean, I wasn't old enough to vote for Obama in 2008, but I would. But I
flex.
I know, right? So I'm not forced to make that. I was never tricked because I couldn't vote. But so, I mean, the idea of populist politicians making or politicians who index populism in some way surging in the polls is not new. That goes all the way back to 2008 and Obama sort of changing the rhetoric from an establishment to a more broad message about hope and change in the future. To go to the question about race and gender and Sanders, I mean, it depends on who's critiquing that, right? If you're hearing it from segments to the left, there are real implications or real critiques of Sanders' inability or lack of fluency on, issues not necessarily related to class, right? Issues, I think that the impulses there are good. He speaks about race and gender, I think, from a place that shows that he cares about people who don't look like him. But he's not a sociology professor. He's not an Africana studies professor. He's not a women and gender studies professor. He's somebody who spent the past 3-4 decades being a politician and engaging in that world and in that language. On the opposite side of that, the people who I think that people on the right who are holding that against him are people to his right rather are doing so and then forgetting that the other candidates are somehow worse. I have a hard time thinking of a candidate in this particular race who has mastered the language of social justice in a way that is better or notably better than Bernie Sanders has, and doesn't also have some sort of weird skeleton in their closet
Isn't
about.
it also problematic to elevate so much language over actual things? I think with Warren, I think it's great. I don't like using that she was a Republican, whatever. I don't like that approach to things. I think it's great she has different politics, but if you're gonna play that game, it's okay, Bernie Sanders is speaking out against the Reagan agenda, including homophobia and on the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. In 2020, he doesn't have everybody's, lingo, whatever. And then Elizabeth Warren, who is voting for Ronald Reagan during that time and not voicing anything, but now has a certain talking points set down. It's ridiculous.
Well, it depends on what language is for. I think when you see
Yeah.
the neoliberal turn in the 1990s, you see the Democrats and you see also the Blairites in the United Kingdom trying to reconfigure the legitimacy of their party from, hey, we are the party of big structural change, to borrow the language of Elizabeth Warren for a second. We do Social Security, we expand Medicare, we do all the New Deal, we do all of that stuff, and that's our central argument for why we are better than the Republicans. And that kind of transitions as corporate money starts coming in to a more ephemeral legitimacy based on this new moral economy of language. Who can master the best language and appeal to those people on those grounds. But I mean, I don't necessarily find it's not to Sanders, it's not a virtue of his that he hasn't mastered that language. But I would contend on the other side of that, it's look at the people who have mastered that language in the Democratic Party. Even Harry Belafonte said this to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and there's a clip of it out there. He said, you've mastered this language of critical race theory and of feminism, but it seems to be devoid of an impulse to actually enact structural change that would be meaningful in enacting, in combating the issues that you are so eloquently describing. It's and I think that speaks to the Democratic Party's impulse, and a big part of their viability right now is that they're currently losing, where, a lot of it is just we can acknowledge this problem exists, racism, sexism, and we can sort of, talk about getting more grants based to the urban youth, more VC money into the projects, a la Cory Booker. But when it comes to actually enacting big structural things that are going to shrink that gap of color, shrink that gap of inequality on class lines as well, they kind of dropped the ball, and now they're being forced to reckon with the fact that that people are no longer interested in that as the sole criteria for who they vote for.
So yeah, the idea is that it's necessary but not sufficient.
It's not sufficient
on both sides. I mean, I think there is an argument that the story was going around today about a guy who in Detroit who he had sued his employer on over racial discrimination, and the lawsuit was settled confidentially. Excuse me. This guy Santor Thomas, and he got a settlement check. Went into a bank, and they refused to cash or deposit it because they didn't believe it was real. And so they called the cops on him.
Oh, my.
And
2 new lawsuits.
And
Please.
so he's now got a lawsuit.
Yes.
But the
Wait,
point,
to the cops too, or just the bank?
the bank,
Okay,
the
good.
bank.
All right.
He's suing the bank for
Hey,
race
I
discrimination.
don't know what the cops are going to be like
saying-
when they show up. You might have a third case.
Yeah, they called 4 police officers when he was trying to deposit the thing. And I guess the point is that I think there is an argument on some level, and I think there may be some disagreement. We had a disagreement about this the other day towards the end, that racism, that part of the way that you get rid of racism, or at the very least, that the part of the way that you get you de-weaponize or you mitigate the impact of racism on some level, has to do with language and in making revoking the license to be racist. I mean, within the context of public. I mean, there's obviously you need to deal with things on a structural level, on a statutory level, and in terms of a policy level, but also that Donald Trump has in many ways given license to people to behave in a more racist fashion, that you can create an environment where racism is acting upon it, having it at the forefront of your mind, and then ultimately acting upon it in that way. You can create an environment where it is more or less acceptable, and where people act on their instincts more. And I mean, that's true for every, I think, human reaction or emotion.
No, I agree. And I think that, but that's sort of the end goal, right? So we talk about, Trump has absolutely made it more legitimate or more acceptable, at least in people's minds, to use racist language to people's face in public in 2020 in a way that was not being seen debatably in 2015, 2014 when we were under Obama. Of course, they were still, that under Obama, that's when George Zimmerman happened as well, right? So we know. Right. However, I think that we have to engage with like the underlying undercurrent of racism that exists within our society as, structurally, implicitly, and even just the coded ways people engage or like promote racist tropes or racist ideas that go beyond simply the symbolic language of racism of like, this person said the N-word on television, right? 'Cause I think that's what people have been conditioned to think of racism as. Its most explicit, its most extreme examples of it. So like, hey, police shooting black people in the street. That shouldn't happen. It's grotesque, especially at the numbers it happens. But I would argue that that's an extreme manifestation of the racism our society has, like extrajudicial killings of black people in the streets, and that's being promoted or propped up by a racist police force, a racist judicial system, the prison industrial complex. And various other structures within our society that help it get to that point where that particular thing is only an extreme and not an anomaly. And I think Trump's representative of that. Going back to what I said about, language in Bernie Sanders, it's not weird. I would say it's not weird for me to see a 79-year-old man who, was radical in the 60s, radical in the 70s, radical in the 80s, and it has been in the government for the past 40 years, like not have mastered the language of modern social. That's not weird. I mean, it's not a virtue, but it's not weird. What is weird, I would argue, is that you have people who have mastered language, who use intersectionality casually, who use like critical race theory casually, who quote like bell hooks casually, but like they also support imperialism and they're not so sure about regime change. And oh my God, like, right. Like all lives matter. And it's like that to me, like speaks to a discordance. Whereas like, some people are just like not necessarily are vulgar in their analysis of society. That's not particularly like, it's not like language is not their strong suit because it's entirely, I would say, functional for them, versus people who are using language to obscure the fact that they don't necessarily support the thing that they're supposed to.
And may I just add, that's what Cornel West said. He's like, look, we don't know all the lingo, but we know where the values are. And I also think that like the other thing that's, I actually, one area that I agree with Sam that it actually shocks me generally, absolutely across the Democratic field, is that none of them, that there hasn't been, and they all have proposals and have talked about it a little bit, but I would absolutely be talking about voting rights and voter disenfranchisement, frankly, just even as crass self-interest right now, because it's a major thing. But besides that, it is incredible to me when people go after Sanders, and it's like, and we've talked about this, but on the other hand, it's like, I believe that the numbers in 2016, it would be only more so now if it was the case then, that if you enacted a version of the Sanders program, it would be the largest wealth transfer along race lines since Reconstruction. So the idea that, especially when it comes to like the corporate types who, attack him on this stuff constantly, but actually they, oppose all of these really important things. If you want to be real, I'm not going to use this terminology, but like opposing things like Medicare for All is in some sense objectively racist. Opposing these redistributive programs, they have enormous implications there.
Yeah. Well, people don't see austerity as violence, and people don't see austerity as racism because those are not explicitly written into the programs. Even though, just to use one example, the 2008 financial crisis was the single biggest hit to black wealth since black people started to be allowed to own wealth in this country. And a lot of people see that those things are inextricably connected.
Well, part of that is that people seem to be unable, with this change of how the Democratic Party legitimized itself in people's mind, people seem to be unable to like think about anti-racist policies or the potential anti-racism of policies or anti-sexism or whatever you're talking about, unless it like explicitly centers that particular group, right? It's explicit, which again, you should have policies that explicitly center those groups, but to deny the effect that those policies would have on those groups is not the way to combat that. It's just erasing the fact that because of the intersection of class and race, that anything that benefits people who are poor will disproportionately benefit people of color, will disproportionately benefit people who are otherwise vulnerable. And so, I think that we see that argument that like, unless this policy explicitly names the group, it can't count as anti-racism as a way to obscure the fact that they're not interested in doing anything, any of those policies.
Yes. Oh, here's another example of that. I'm reading about Daniel Denver's book right now. We have had racist immigration policies for a very long time, but they're not written in racist language. They're written in the language of national security or protecting American jobs or whatever. What Trump did was he pulled the mask off. He said a bunch of racist stuff, and then he passed these racist policies that were overturned by the courts until he was able to put it. They were able to put it in the language of national security and put the mask back on in the way that it always had been. And that's when the court upheld it.
Well, that was basically, the Muslim ban. They think they did that like 2 or 3 times. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of data, too, that just sort of like the sensitivity to these things has changed dramatically, between the Obama years and the Trump years. Everything, but the vast majority of things have become caught up in race politics.
Well, the point is that the race politics were always there. They're just coming.
Well,
to the
by race
forefront
politics,
now.
I mean seen through the prism of this.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
so that the implications of these policies were there, but now they're bound up in it.
I mean, I would argue that anything that, any sort of conversation like this that contends that Sanders has not mastered any particular language of race has to contend with the fact that Sanders is ahead with Black youth, right? People any conversation about like Sanders not being particularly like skillful on the issues of race, there are obviously Black people who are promoting that, people of color who are promoting that like that because they feel very strongly about it and they have good legitimate critiques. But for people who are making that critique, they have to contend with the fact that like obviously large portions or plurality of Black people do not feel that way about Sanders. And much like the Kamala Harris dropping out situation, I would, and I wouldn't argue, I would say there does seem to be a significant amount of this that is just, a complaint rooted in the current form of legitimacy of the Democratic Party, which okay, well, if Sanders doesn't master the language of race, if we don't have enough Black people in the primary, that makes our party look bad. That makes our party look bad.
Well, as the optics. I mean, and those optics do make a difference. I mean, you see, the Republicans when they get together for a picture of the Judiciary Committee, it's just all white guys. It does make you good. Like it is pretty stark. But yes, I agree. And let me just add this, and then. If you'll stay with us, we're going to check in with our film critic, who's live at Sundance, walking actually en route to his film.
Some former filmmaker,
and he does want the picture to be his badge. If we can manage that. Did you get that?
I'm on it.
Okay,
that's cool.
But I just wanted to say this: that there has not been that much written about this. I know Malika Jabali has written about it, but also there was a piece in the Times, an opinion piece in 2000. Oh, here it is. In 2018, Sean McElwee, Jesse Rhodes, Brian Schaffner, and Bernard Fraga did a data analysis of those 3 different types of Obama voters who did not vote for Clinton: the Obama to Trump voter, the Obama to nobody voter, the Obama to third party voter. 9% of Obama's 2012 voters went for Trump in 2016. 7%, which is more than 4 million, stayed home. Yep. 3% voted for a third party candidate. And the distinction, these are pretty distinct groups, at least the first 2. I think they did most of their analysis. The 51% of the stay at home, Obama to stay at home, were people of color. Only 16% of the Obama to Trump voters were people of color. 34% was the Obama to Clinton voters. So that's the sort of like the baseline. So you had nearly, much more concentration of people of color stayed home during that, and more white people went to Trump, essentially. 23% of Obama to non-voters were under 30, compared with 11% of Obama to Trump voters and 10% of Obama to Clinton voters. So you had more than double the rate of young people under 30 staying at home than they did during,
another reason we should be thanking Joe Rogan.
Well,
though it's funnily enough, I looked it up. He's a 2-time Obama, 1-time Gary Johnson.
Yeah.
So it really tracks.
Right. And we should also say that it also tracks with, my completely baseless theory that, or I shouldn't say baseless, but
totally baseless. I agree.
Completely unsubstantiated theory that Bernie's black voters and people of color, voters, non-white voters, I guess, are lower propensity voters than Biden's. And that Biden is getting, is attracting votes for people who will come out and vote for the Democratic nominee under any circumstance, regardless of who they are.
I think Biden is skating by on just like Obama clout. I mean, it's very easy to explain why Biden is appealing to black voters. Obama,
right?
Like, I do, even before the primary started, when I was talking to especially the older black population, it was like, my favorite is Biden because Obama picked him as his VP. They did not aware that it was a gesture to racist usually.
Right, exactly.
Biden was a diversity hire to prove that Obama wasn't too radical.
Exactly.
And, so like that, but even those people, like the older blacks I spoke to were like, Biden's my first choice, but Bernie is a second choice because I like what he's saying, right? Biden gets a lot of his legitimization from the Democratic Party establishment, from clout sharking Obama. And Bernie is appealing to these people because, like my grandmother's on Social Security. Like my grandmother relies on Social Security for a large part of her income because she worked her entire life in a blue collar job, and now she's retired and she had kids, and like Social Security forms a big part of her income. So I think that there is this impulse to forget that like black people are voting in ways that materially benefit themselves. And I would even add like that black people, the black community is not necessarily the ones who went to war with Trump. They're not immunized from the just undercurrent of neoconservative racism and xenophobia that goes on in America, generally speaking. The only difference is that the Republican Party hates us. It's just like,
but hasn't amongst African Americans.
We got to go because we are already late.